All right, this notion that humans are causing the planet to heat up and that most of the claimed 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming over the last century has been caused by humans is quickly debunked when you consider that humans have only added 1.4 parts CO2 to 10,000 parts total atmosphere. This is what 1.4 parts out of 10,000 looks like. I'm sorry, if you believe that adding 1.4 parts to 10,000 parts is altering Earth's weather, either you are a complete gullible moron or you just don't care because climate change has become your religious cult. Right now, CO2 levels out in Hawaii are at 421 parts per million. Keep in mind that humans didn't add all of this CO2. What were levels at 150 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution? Well, the scientists claim about 280 parts per million. I'll take their word on that. We didn't start measuring CO2 levels out in Hawaii until 1958. Back then, it was at 316 parts per million. And I'm getting these figures from an alarmist website. And by the way, notice how on this site, how they stretched the graph to make an eensy-weensy rise in CO2 levels look like a lot. This is straight out of Chapter 5 in the book, How to Lie with Statistics. But people fall for this stuff. Scientists fall for this stuff. Another way they lie with statistics is, of course, when they talk about 420 parts per million instead of 140 parts per million, which is the portion that humans have added to the atmosphere. Another way is when they talk in parts per million, because 140 parts per million sounds scarier than 0.014% or 1.4 parts per 10,000. And so, the people over at Mythbusters evidently are also skilled liars with statistics. If they were being honest with the CO2 experiment that they did on this Discovery Network show a long time ago, then they would have added just 140 parts per million more CO2 to the test chamber than what was in the control chamber. Why didn't they do that? Because there would have been no warming, and because the margin of error when dealing with such eensy-weensy amounts of gas and, slight imperfections between one test chamber and the other, the margin of error is much greater than the tiny amount of temperature rise that you could possibly ever demonstrate by this experiment. And so what did they do? They brought CO2 levels up to about 7.351%. That's about 175 times more CO2 than the current existing 0.042% in Earth's atmosphere. And more importantly, that's 525 times more CO2 than we humans have added to the atmosphere over the last 150 years. So in their little science project, by pumping in all the CO2, they mustered up an increase of 0.9 degrees Celsius. But okay, let's use their little science project study to calculate how, instead, if we added just 140 parts per million, how much would that little bit of CO2 increase the temperature of this test chamber? Now, if we were to express the total atmosphere as 100, then we would express the amount of CO2 that they pumped into this test chamber as 7.351, and we would express the amount of CO2 that humans have added to the atmosphere over the last 150 years as 0.014. Keep in mind, this is 1/100ths of 1%. We're not talking about 1%. We're not even talking about tenths of 1%. This is 0.014. But so let's calculate the magnitude at which they exaggerated this experiment. The multiple of CO2 they added versus the 1.4 parts per million CO2 that humans have actually added, just to show you the math. So we take the 7.351% CO2 level in their test chamber. To be fair, we want to subtract the pre-existing CO2 that existed in the air before the Industrial Revolution, that 280 parts per million. That would take 7.351% down to 7.323. So divide that number by 0.014 of human added CO2 to the atmosphere over the last 150 years, and we arrive at 523. That's the magnitude at which they exaggerated this experiment. And so it took that much exaggeration to raise the temperature in this test chamber by, 0.9 degrees Celsius? And so this brings us to the question of, well, how much is just 1.4 parts per million worth in terms of warming effect over the last 150 years? Well, you would simply divide 0.9 degrees by 523 and arrive at 0.0017 degrees Celsius. That's a fraction of 1/100th of a degree. Are you starting to see how this global warming stuff is a complete scam? Let's move on to the question of how much will temperatures go up by the end of the century. They say that CO2 levels are going to reach 800 parts per million, with humans, of course, only being responsible for 520 parts per million of that. So first we determine the exaggeration factor. Their experiment is 140.8 times exaggerated. Then we would take the temperature increase from their experiment, 0.9 degrees, divided by the factor of 140.8, and we arrive at 0.00639 degrees Celsius. So about 2/3 of 1/100th of a degree. That's the human impact after 225 years or whatnot. I can just hear them conjuring up a statistic, though. I can hear them saying, oh my God, the temperature increased 375%. The planet is boiling over. When you're pushing a sham, just lie with statistics. By the way, here's something else. The sun only shines on half of the earth at a time. So does that mean that instead of 1/156th of a degree, it should be 1/312th of a degree? And of course, I haven't even gotten into talking about Earth's thousands of feedback mechanisms, clouds, plant absorption, ocean absorption, that you can't replicate in a science experiment. So now you know why in every single one of these science experiments that you see on YouTube, they saturate the test chamber with CO2. It's because that's what it takes to actually move the thermometer. These people are conning you. These are the same people who tell you that a man can be a woman, the same people who lied to you about everything, COVID. And if you say anything to the contrary, you must be silenced because the science is settled.